Alright folks, let's do this. Welcome everybody. And let's have a nice little chat about underrated things. Like antibiotics, as somebody already pointed out. Certainly underrated. And would have made a major difference in medieval times, but yeah, took a little bit longer than that. So, let me just check one thing real quick, and then we'll get right to it. Okay, all right then. Gun swords are underrated? Are you sure about that? I mean, in Final Fantasy VIII, they're certainly rather overrated, as far as I'm concerned. But, oh well. Okay, let me just resize. I have to do this every time. You'd think that the window size stays the same and the alignment and everything, but nah. No, bro. It changes every damn time. That's what it does. There we go. That's better. So thank you, King Mullock Pro and Casey Chapin. Or Chapin? I have no idea. Anyway. So I'm going to give you two that I think are, just to start off with, that I think are very much underrated. And the first one is one that is people usually mention the spear, or really pole arms in general. They're not very, they're very underrepresented, let's put it that way, in fantasy. It's usually all about swords, maybe hammers and maces. Well, maces, not even so much. Yeah, hammers and axes more than spears. I mean, some games skip spears and polearms completely, and they're very important on historical battlefields, of course, and they're very useful. That's the obvious one. Not so obvious maybe is, I would say, daggers, because if you look at daggers in games, it's usually kind of a underhanded rogue weapon, for assassins and all that's usually the very low damage kind of weapon that can't do anything against armor unless it does critical damage, which actually isn't so terribly far from the truth in a way. If you look at how they were used historically as basically anti-armor weapons, I mean, not the only ones, of course, but daggers were very important on the battlefield for dealing with armor. If you take a fully armored knight down, either through grappling or just, battering them until they fall down with large heavy weapons, denting the armor makes it harder for them to move, and you will hurt them, but that's, in a lot of cases, that's not what kills them. And, I mean, on an actual historical medieval battlefield, you don't actually want to kill the knight anyway. You want to capture them and ransom them because there's good money in it. But if you have to, the dagger is the way to go, because you can find the gaps of the armor, which there always will be. There's always going to be at least an eye slit. There's going to be gaps under the armpits and really in the joints where you need the flexibility. That's where you usually only have mail, and that can be penetrated with a dagger. So that's the dagger as an anti-armor weapon is not usually on anyone's radar as far as fantasy weapons are concerned. Now, to be fair, in most cases, it's kind of difficult to do, like in terms of fighting mechanics. But yeah, certainly underrated in that sense, in my opinion. So let me see what other suggestions we have here. Death brooms and back scratchers. I mean, back scratchers, if you're single, are definitely underrated. if you're married, you have somebody to scratch your back, so that's not a problem. The murder stroke gets no love. I agree. It is definitely underrepresented, although you've seen it in a few games in recent times, so it starts to get more attention, it seems. But that's a technique and not a weapon, of course. Wouldn't primitive firearms also be in this category because they have been around since about the 10th century? Oh, sorry, my tongue still doesn't want to quite obey me. This damn dental surgery just wreaked havoc on my nerves, apparently. So, I mean, the good old handgun is, I mean, you sometimes see it. War of the Roses, for example, had them, and they were pretty cool in that game. I mean, it's a mini cannon on a stick. It's not a very sophisticated weapon, obviously. It wasn't terribly effective. I mean, it was used, had some psychological impact, and at close distance, it was probably reasonably effective against armor, but rather crude overall. War scythes. Yes, there were actually war scythes. No, they look a little different than your standard scythe. This would be a war scythe. So it's more like a glaive, various other pole arms. Not that scythe-like, at least if you compare it to an agricultural scythe. You know, this is more along the lines of an agricultural scythe, and of course that's a classic reaper scythe. Those were not used on the battlefield, as far as I know, in that form, because it's just not really useful for that. That design is made for cutting wheat and grass at ankle height. That's not what you do in battle, but yeah, absolutely, they did exist. Another thing that I wanted to just show you briefly. This is a little bit off topic, but I just found it while setting up for this video. This is kind of amusing. So some mock weapons for D&D. The honeycomb sledgehammer, cloud gauntlets, cactus club. That looks painful. Gun on 9 tails. The catless. That's an excellent choice. The flailigator. Banana split saber. The Boroborus. What even? That's probably a reference that I'm not getting. A bug bomb. Grass knuckles. That's a good one. An arm holding onto another arm that's holding onto a knife. Sounds like some necromancer shenanigans. Tide pool sickle. Regular sword, but the blade just goes on forever. Katana. Yeah, just as a side note. Okay, let's see what else the chat is saying. Crow's beak hammer. I mean, it's basically just a spike on a regular warhammer for the most part. Either that or a war pick. A stick. Well, I mean, clubs, various wooden clubs can be reasonably effective. You know, they're simple, quote unquote primitive, but can still be pretty good if they're properly shaped and made of the right kind of wood, especially if you have various hardwoods like ironwood, for example, or even just ash is pretty decent. Obviously, they made quarterstaffs out of ash, so Trident. Yeah. I mean, I do see tridents sometimes in fantasy settings, but they still fall under the spear / pole weapon thing, where it's just pole weapons are just not common in fantasy. For some reason, they don't get much love. It depends on the individual setting and game, etc. But Kali sticks? Oh, it's just sticks. I mean, in an unarmored stick fight, of course, yeah, sure, they work. But if you have to go against any sword, let alone pole arm, you would be pretty royally screwed. Pretty royally indeed. Not sure I would agree with that. Falchions are underrated. I would say falchions are generally regarded as pretty effective in fantasy. I mean, sometimes they're in fact, I mean, they're misrepresented sometimes. They're sometimes portrayed as this armor cleaver, which they really aren't. Bucklers are considered garbage. Oh, yeah, that's absolutely true. Garbage shields in fantasy. That's very true. I mean, the buckler is just is kind of the ugly stepchild of the shield in fantasy games. But they're quite effective in a lot of ways, especially in a dueling setting. They're of course more agile, easier to use, less exhausting, easier to carry. That's really one of the major reasons. Now, to be fair, that's not something that really comes into play in games. Like ease of carry, which game cares about that? You have an inventory and you can cram more into that than would ever be feasible, and you know that's what you want as a player. Personally, I hate tiny inventories. They're just tedious and frustrating and annoying. You want to go full collector pack rat in games with weapons, at least I do. So there's of course a bit of a limitation there, but yeah, certainly underrated. Pole arms, yep. Thrusting swords like rapiers or S-talks, yeah, quite often. Not in Dark Souls, of course, where the S-talk is best talk, or used to be at least. Gunpowder, just by itself. Well, you know what? I would actually say that firearms can be quite underrated, actually, especially in fantasy settings where you have both firearms and swords and whatnot. Firearms just are these puny little pea shooters that like you can empty 10 rounds into someone and they're just going to be like, yeah, that stung a little bit. So that is a little weird. Again, gameplay, in terms of gameplay mechanics, that's hard to avoid, but it's certainly amusing. And yeah, spears, again, like Quinn says, poor spearmen, as always, a cannon fodder for the superpowered main characters. Yeah, I mean, spears are quite often portrayed in fantasy as basically toothpicks that the swords just shear right through and cut cleanly in half or break off or whatever. It's just the flimsiest little excuse for a weapon. That's really silly. Have there ever been any wooden melee weapons? Plenty, actually. In fact, I made an entire video about non-metal weapons. There's a lot. New zombie knife bans, like the new one in NSW. Haven't heard of new zombie knife bans, but at this point, you can't exactly be surprised. Any real weapon armors besides things on the hand? It's an interesting question. I think what you described there, you could basically say something like a basket hilt on a sword would fall under that. Like just large hand guards are not really armor, weapon armor, but I mean you can kind of look at it that way. Or something like a hooded Qatar, which I'm gonna show you right now. which is, you know, sort of the armored version of a guitar, if you will. You know, it's got the additional guard there to protect the hand, so kind of. You can kind of call it that. And of course, the pata, I mean, this is probably the closest to what you're describing, because it's also referred to as sword gauntlet, and for good reason. I mean, it is essentially kind of a gauntlet that a sword blade was attached to. So yeah, that would be the closest to what you're describing there. Man catcher. Them memes though. S-Talks, yep, certainly underrated outside of Dark Souls. The fantasy setting as a whole, or wait. The fantasy setting as a whole is weird about weapons such as 15th century weapons mixed with 10th century weapons. Yeah, that's... Centuries are just kind of all melting into one, which, you know, to be fair, fantasy, I mean, you wouldn't want to restrict everything to one century, because then it's no longer fantasy, right? So I do actually like the mishmash. And most of it is, of course, just inspired by history, because it is fantasy, so it is supposed to be different. But yeah, thank you very much for all the super chats so far, folks. It definitely helps out the channel and makes it easier for me to catch up with, because there are not anywhere near as many super chats as there are comments in the regular chat. But speaking of which, what are people saying here? Xyphos. Yeah, basically you only see the Xyphos or weapons or swords like it in anything that's intentionally Greek themed, or, you know, Greek-esque, if that's a word. Whereas the Gladius you do see in other fantasy. Like, it's not just in Roman themed fantasy that you see at least short swords that look a lot like a gladius. I don't see too many that really look much like a Xyphos. I mean, okay, some short swords can kind of look like them, and the Xyphos with its leaf blade, you know, leaf-shaped blades are pretty popular in fantasy, so some can look kind of like it, but there's more Gladius lookalikes, I would say. It's just a more well-known sword type, I think. Crossbows, because bows are always better. I don't know, some games have, and settings have really powerful crossbows. Especially when they just skip the loading. Or just chop it down so much that it just becomes this, pull it back with one hand, insert bolt, there you go. And for some reason it's still powerful, even though that would be weak as hell if you could just lazily span it with one hand. But of course, you know, for gameplay purposes, it would be generally useless if you had to go through the entire loading process with a windlass. Or even just a goat's foot lever. It would take too, well, that's not quite true. In War of the Roses, I think there was a crossbow spanned with a goat's foot, so it can be done sometimes, but it is challenging to make it fit into the gameplay without completely imbalancing it. A YouTuber made a round folding umbrella shield. Okay. I haven't seen that. That sounds pretty wild. The Yatagan, yeah, you know what? I would agree with that. It's one that I definitely like. I like the blade on those. Never know if it's spelled with that H or not, because you see it sometimes with and sometimes without. Not so much this type. I prefer the type that has a more pronounced recurve. Yeah, more like this, or perhaps that. Some of them have a pretty strong recurve, and that's the type that I really like personally. Yeah, this is very pronounced. That's quite nice. And yeah, you don't see them terribly often. true great swords, not just mixing up a long sword with a great sword. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's also the thing that people, quite often when they hear greatsword, they think of a very specific type, like basically the German Zweihänder type. So what I mean is the type with, yeah, the parrying hooks right there and the large guard with the rings. That's usually what people think of when they think greatsword, but of course it can be. There's a number of two-handed swords that just don't look like that, but are still classified as great swords because of their sheer size. Like this, for example. That's a clear example of a great sword, but if this was shorter, if this had a shorter handle and overall was scaled down, it would just be a longsword. So sometimes the difference between a longsword and a greatsword is simply the size, and there is a bit of gray area. At what point does a large longsword become a small greatsword? It's a little bit arbitrary, the boundary, if you want to set a boundary. I mean, slender great swords like this are definitely underrepresented in fantasy because a lot of the times there are these humongous, thick, wide paddles that look nothing like a actually usable great sword. And there are a lot of examples of really slim and slender looking great swords. Like they are long and large overall, but nowhere near as wide. Now this, for example, also is a two-handed sword. At first glance, you wouldn't be able to tell. Like if you just see the picture, you could think this is a longsword, and it is kind of hard to distinguish. Anyway, are javelins considered spears? Yes, a javelin is basically a subtype of spear. And in fact, quite often, it can be difficult to even tell them apart. A one-handed spear from a javelin. A two-handed spear is going to be obvious. It's going to be way larger. But a lot of single-handed spears that would be used together with a shield, you can't necessarily tell, is this just a melee spear or is it designed just for throwing? What you can tell is in some cases it's clearly a javelin. Like for example, the Ango is damn it. Or Angon, as it's also Angon is the other spelling. These are clear throwing spears. You can usually tell they quite often have barbs, which is something you don't want on a melee spear because it will just get stuck and make it harder to extract and cause you all kinds of trouble while fighting. And then sometimes you have these weights. And there, of course, the pilum is a very clear example of a javelin. So you can tell that sometimes where it's obvious subtypes, but I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure I would personally call the pilum a spear, but it is. I mean, it's just a specialized spear. The wakizashi, always overshadowed. Yeah, it is generally overshadowed by the katana. I would agree with that. But it does pop up fairly commonly just when dual wielding it together with the katana. Like the combination katana wakizashi is, I think, reasonably common. Okay. Never heard of that, but we will check it out. Thank you. Valkyrie skirt. What? Like, really?
What?
This is... What? I'm gonna have to do it a third time. That... All the memes. All the memes. Like, wow. That is one of the most ridiculous things I've ever seen. That's a level of ridiculous. Like the minigun, you know, several like circular minigun barrels that come out of the skirt that I've shown in another video is just wow. Creativity and LSD, not always a desirable combination. Anyway, I would love to see more tomahawk throwing. Okay. Boomerangs have always been awesome. Yeah, sometimes you see sharp boomerangs as throwing weapons, not very commonly. But yeah. Tomahawks, I mean, throwing axes are reasonably common. It's usually... It's not so much tomahawks. It's usually more the Frankish type. Of course. There, this type. That's kind of the most common, kind of the stereotypical throwing axe, if you will. Yes, katanas, uber sharp super swords, etc., etc. When in reality they would shatter the moment they struck a plate armor breastplate. They wouldn't shatter, they would bend. I mean, the edge would get seriously chewed up, so the edge would probably chip because the edge is extremely hard and then the spine is very soft. So if you strike solid steel plate as hard as you can, you will produce a lot of edge damage, and chances are the blade will also bend. So just not really designed for that. Any thoughts on Naginata versus spear? Well, a Naginata is almost like a spear that can cut. Either that or, I mean, essentially it's a sword on a stick. It is... The blade is usually not quite like a katana. It's shaped a little differently, but at first glance it looks somewhat like that. I mean, you have basically more versatility with the Naginata because you can cut as well. You can with a spear, just not as well. I'd say in terms of just pure power in the thrust, and as far as penetrating armor is concerned, especially mail, I would definitely bet on the spear rather than the Naginata because it's it doesn't taper as much, and the point is generally wider and thicker. So it's... I'm not sure how easy it would be to penetrate mail with a Naginata. I would like to try that at some point. I'll just have to get my hands on a better made one, because the one Naginata I have is a cheapo thing, so you can't really go by that. Yep, bucklers, as mentioned before. Only representation I've seen was from Skyrim mods, thus they didn't behave realistically in combat because of Skyrim's simple mechanics. Yeah. Let's see. Kingdom Come, I think, has bucklers that are being shown in a realistic way. But generally, it's really hard to do that in terms of gameplay mechanics, because you don't, most of the time, you don't just hold the buckler in front of you like a regular shield. You use it actively and you use it to cover your hands. So it's it can be used for passive defense, but it can also be used very actively to wrench an opponent's weapon or strike with, and, you know, bind, etc., etc. It's a very complex thing, you know, in actual historical sword and buckler combat. So that's hard to do, really, in fantasy, or at least accurately. Pommels are underrated. Are you sure about that? Are you really, like, do you want to think that statement through? Are there any buckler mods for Mountain Blade? I thought there were already bucklers in Mountain Blade, at least. Maybe I misremember, but I think there are bucklers. But they're, again, used like larger shields, so... Targe, yeah, you know, I have to agree with that. That's a type that you don't... Okay, no, scratch that. As I'm saying that, wait a moment. And while I'm saying that, I changed my mind. The thing is, the targe, the Scottish targe, in the way it was made, that's something that you don't see very often. This kind of pattern with all the rivets, and especially the spike in the center, in exactly this way, it's not that common. But at the same time, this is kind of the most generic possible shield that you see in fantasy. It's usually, when a round shield is being shown, 8 times out of 10 it's this. It's a strapped round shield. Whereas a center grip round shield doesn't appear anywhere near as often. So, yeah, what I mean by that is like the classic Viking shield. That you don't see as often as the strapped shield. Alright, you should do a video on the armor and weapons in the 13th Warrior. You think? I mean, thanks for the suggestion and the super chat. I mean, I guess I could do that. It's not going to be pretty because the movie is... I remember really liking it when I saw it back then, but it's got a lot of weirdnesses to it. Because it's got this pseudo-historical setting where, like, it's clearly fantasy, but it's also kind of presenting itself as sort of historical or alternate history or whatever. You know, that sort of thing. Pommels are highly dangerous. You are highly correct. Trebuchet throwing 90-kilogram pommels. You just want to punch a hole into the earth, don't you? That's some serious mass destruction level right there. Nets have been underrated in fantasy games. Yeah, you don't see nets very often. Nets and bolas and things like that, which are really hard to do in games. I mean, with the one exception is things like MOBAs, for example, where you throw a net over someone and the net just disappears, but it gives them, you know, it reduces their movement speed or whatever. That happens every now and then. And that's really the only good way you can do that. Like, actually making them entangled and unable to fight effectively at all would, for one, be kind of overkill. And also, you would have to make an entirely different set of animations for that. So it's kind of tricky. At the very least, bucklers shouldn't block arrows. I mean, they could, it's just difficult because of how little coverage you get. But yeah, but for all intents and purposes, it should not be possible. It's like you can maybe, if you're lucky, you can maybe catch one, or if you have superhuman reflexes or whatever. But yeah, generally, it's not useful against arrows. Okay. Let me show people what that is. It's a... wasn't it the type that is kind of being debated? Is that a... if that's a spear or some kind of pole axe or, you know, some sort of polearm in general? I think that was kind of... I remember reading into that And in the sagas, it's kind of hard to say exactly what that is. Yeah, it's often translated to halberd or something, but we don't have any finds of anything even remotely like a halberd from the Viking Age. So they had Dane axes, but polearms like that, not really. But yeah, perfect for fantasy speculation. I agree. Like you can speculate all you like. The 36th chamber of Shaolin. No, I've not seen that. The Fusha. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure I've ever seen one either in games. It's a pretty ugly one in my opinion. Well, okay. This type at least. I'm not fond of that. This is okay aesthetically, but yeah. I'd rather not that it matters, not that aesthetics matter for fighting, but and of course it's effective and all, but some of them are really hideous to me at least. Anyway, which weapons would a six-armed warrior use? I mean, you can apply the same logic for 4 arms to 6. It's going to be even more potential for entanglement and you can go for similar combinations as with 4 though. 6 spears. Brigantine armor. Yeah. Yeah, it's not that common in fantasy. Well, I've seen it pop up every now and then, but not as common as mail or plate or scale. Scale is kind of overrepresented, as well as leather armor, of course. Let's see. Very unique and ornate blades carried by ancient peoples in northern Africa and the Middle East. The Kilij, the Talwar, and the Shotel in particular. Yeah. You sometimes see the Shotel in really more historical fantasy that's set in a desert environment. The Kilij. You sometimes see shamshirs and scimitars, which look pretty similar at first glance, and the Talwar, yeah, that was totally underrepresented. I have to agree. Ninja grenades. Realistic female armor is a rare find, yes. Certainly. Yep, daggers I already covered earlier in the stream. Yeah, the Holy Hand Grenade of Antioch. Definitely underrepresented. Not a weapon, but the gambeson. Not so much anymore. In recent fantasy, I've seen that a lot more than it used to be shown. I mean, you still see generic leather vests and, jerkins and stuff. Much more often than gambesons, but you start to see them sometimes. 4-armed warrior could use a rifle with 2 hands, and the other 2 could be reloading the weapon. Yeah, basically. I mean, would it be really quicker, though? If you've practiced it, you can be very fast with it. I mean, essentially, in a lot of cases, if you're... Especially if it's a kind of rifle where you just have to hit the mag release and it just falls out on its own. Or the AK, for example, where you shoot, meanwhile you grab the next magazine, You pop out the existing magazine with the one you're holding, slam it right in, and you're done. I don't think using more arms would actually really make a difference. You can be very fast with that. I mean, just watch some of the professional IPSC shooters, and it's insane. Like, the way they reload a pistol, for example. It's literally, while they drop the magazine, they already grab the next one. And the moment the magazine clears, they already slam the next one in. It's literally impossible to be any faster than that. So, well, what you could do, though, funny thought, is you could use the rifle, and meanwhile with the other arms you could actually grab a completely empty magazine and just reach into a pocket with cartridges and actually top up the magazine, or just refill empty magazines and then put them back with the other magazine, so that would still be useful for sure. And you could be tossing grenades with the lower arms, You playing Sekiro? Nope. I don't really have much time for gaming and been having a hard time to get into anything lately. Bronze weapons in general? Yep. Bronze is pretty underrated overall. Magic pizza. Yes, I want me some magic pizza right now. Ideally, where the magic effect is that you don't have to pay for it and it doesn't make you fat. I mean, I would pay for it if it was just magically infused pizza that turns all the energy that is stored inside the pizza into just muscle directly. I would look like a hulking steroid monster after a while if that was available. Anyway, I came for the meme thumbnail. You better post it. Okay. I mean, fine, I guess. Let's see. I mean, it's just going to be the same thing except larger, but if that's what you're looking for, you can have it, good sir. Here. Let's get that there. Very special request right here. In fact, I'm gonna just add the really large version just so you're extra satisfied. There it is. Okay, that's a bit too large. That is huge. Still too large. There. Are you happy now? It's huge. Yeah, there you go. I'm just gonna cover my face with it. There. Just so you're pleased. But do gambesons actually count as armor in game? Sometimes. In some they do. Just very light armor. Okay, that's enough. Alright. Chinese flying guillotines. Yeah, that's very, very special. They're pretty cool, but very crazy. Ringed Knight paired greatswords from Dark Souls 3. Paired greatswords? That's actually fairly common. I mean, Diablo 2 did it quite a while ago. A long time ago at this point. And you see that sometimes, this kind of craziness. Any chance of getting any sparring videos of HEMA versus any Japanese/Chinese styled butterfly swords? Could be cool. I'd like to do that, but I don't know anyone who does. Well, I mean, you can find people who do kendo, but that's not really... That's just too sporterized, I would say. I don't know anybody in this area who does kenjutsu. I don't know anybody who does... Well, the problem with Chinese martial arts, like Sword Sage has already talked about it at great depth. The problem with that is that a lot of it is just a more aesthetical form kind of version. It's not really combat oriented. You have combat techniques kind of hidden in those forms, but in a lot of cases people don't actually know anymore what the actual combat application is, or which combat techniques are hidden in there, kind of stylized. And so there's not a whole lot of people who spar, for example, with swords in Chinese swordsmanship. So that would be really hard to find anybody who does that. I mean, Sword Sage, obviously, but it's kind of hard to get him up here. I mean, he's planning to come up here for a visit in perhaps May, but we'll have to see if that works out. Thanks, Scott. And the Zulfikar. Yeah. It's not something that you see a whole lot in that form at the very... I mean, you do sometimes see the dual points, I will say that. But this version here, I've never seen that in particular. Also this, this tang protrusion here. That's something that you don't see very much in fantasy, at least I haven't. Would a gun hammer be effective and plausible? Short answer, no. For a number of reasons. And definitely not safe either. I mean, there was an actual historical hammer with gun barrels in it that I covered in what was a video called again? The weirdest guns, or something like that. So, yeah. But I highly, highly doubt the effectiveness of that. War picks aren't super common. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you see them, but not super often. Golden Dog, yeah. That's true. Have I ever seen that in a game? I don't think I have. Just a spike on a stick is not something you normally see. So, yeah. Not sure I've ever seen that covered in fantasy. Would be interesting, though. Pointy club. 18th century air rifles. Yeah, that's a good point. There were some pretty interesting ones, and fairly powerful ones too, which is, a lot of people are not aware that air guns existed that early, but they did. It's pretty cool. I think there's a Golden Dog in Battle Brothers, which seems pretty historical overall. It definitely took a lot from actual equipment back then. Warband has it? Not surprising. Warband is almost not even fantasy. I mean, it is, because it's set in like a alternate Earth or whatever, but it's so close to history. That's the ironic part. I find it so funny to see something like Warband, which is technically not even this actual Earth, not actual Earth's history, but it's some parallel thing or whatever. But it's so much closer to history than settings that claim to be historical. You know, like Assassin's Creed or, you know, a number of games that claim to be set in medieval times, but so crazy fantasy that has really nothing to do with real historical Earth. Actual sword pistols like Cervantes and Soul Calibur. You see them sometimes, but yeah, not super common. What are your thoughts on the L1 move of the Farron Greatsword from Dark Souls 3? I can't tell you what the L1 move of that particular greatsword is. Sorry. I haven't played it that much. And even if I had, I probably couldn't remember. So, thank you, but sorry, I have no idea. And I doubt I can find that. That's very specific. The Buck Knuck. Underrated, yeah. I mean, is it really underrated? Because it's such a niche thing. Because basically it's an assassination tool, or you know, it's really more of a assassination slash hidden concealed self-defense tool, perhaps. Then again, you do have assassin classes in fantasy games, so it would still make sense to have that. Then again, you have a number of claw fist weapons, so there's that at least. The puppies, yeah. I most certainly agree with that. You see that pretty rarely in games. Mobile cover to be used with a crossbow or early firearms. Mainly crossbows, really. Shields are extremely underrated even when they're always present. I wouldn't say always, but they can be, certainly. Swordbreaker. I don't know, I've seen them a couple of times. Any kind of comb-like parrying dagger, or daggers with some kinds of hooks or cutouts that could catch a blade. Sometimes spring-loaded triple dagger, yeah, the spring-loaded parrying dagger is, yeah. Can't think of too many instances of that in fantasy. Flail? Nah, flails are, I would say they are generally pretty effective and common in fantasy. World War I face shields and helmet designs? Nope, I've not looked at those so far. Let's see. Right, I remember having seen this before. That's pretty interesting. The mail cover in front, and those look a lot like the goggles that they used in those student duels The name escapes me on top of my head. Come on. I know what it's called. That's terribly vague, but I just want to... Mensur, yeah. There we go. That's it. Mensur goggles. Looks kind of like those. Yeah, this sort of thing. And yeah, the mail against flying shrapnel makes certain sense. I'm not sure I would want to rely on that. I think I would rather want to go for something like this. But yeah, they did use stuff like that. Yes, the Atlatl. I most certainly agree with that. Atlatls are invisible as far as fantasy is concerned. They're never covered, really. Yeah. They should be more common. They're pretty cool. Scythe chariots. I don't know. When chariots are covered in fantasy, I'd say they are pretty... They are generally pretty effective. Or potent, or whatever you want to call them. Chakram is common-ish, and when it's shown, it's... In fact, I would say when the Chakram does show up, it tends to be more on the overpowered side of things. How realistic plunging attacks are where you jump from a higher elevation onto an assassinated opponent. Generally terrible, because the problem is you're not Mario. You cannot change your trajectory in mid-flight. So if they notice it and see you coming or falling, whatever, they can very easily adjust and step aside and just skewer you on the way down. It just seems like such a high-risk maneuver. Use this to make something cool instead of stream. $1.99. Let's see. I could buy some toothpicks and some glue and make like a little toothpick sword sculpture out of it, I guess, if that's what you want. The problem is I was actually planning to stick to just an hour. But now that you told me to not stream, I kind of have to go on for a while longer. Damn you. Just to spite you. You set yourself up for that, you know that, right? Wow, this dude's super salty. Yeah, there was definitely some salt in there, but, you know, I still appreciate it. It still helps out, still helps support the channel, so if there's salt sprinkled on top, then, I mean, suit yourself. I appreciate it either way. People paying to troll, now that's the way to do it. Yeah, I mean, you kind of, I guess you kind of earned yourself a get out of jail free card for trolling. But I don't think this was even intended as trolling necessarily. Somebody just doesn't like live streams and wanted to make sure that I noticed that. It's not that this is going to change anything, because I know that a lot of people like these live streams, and I do like to talk to people and get ideas, especially I generally like this interactive kind of thing where I ask you, what do you think about this and that thing? You know, what is overrated or underrated, or what do you want me to compare? You know, which weapon against which and stuff like that. It's pretty cool. It's just nice to actually interact with people directly and it's easier for me to justify setting time aside for it to directly talk to people, as opposed to trying to plow through the hundreds of comments and messages I get every day. It's just I can't keep up with that. But in this case, it's easier to allocate time for that because the super chats bring in a decent amount, which helps balance out the low ad revenue, and it still makes it a good use of time, like an economical use of time. I hate that I have to think that way, but unfortunately I have to. If I don't, then I get nowhere, and the channel would just die due to lack of funds, basically, if I didn't think about what is economically viable. Plus, I would just work myself to death, which I have done. Like a couple of months ago, I was just trying to, and late 2018 in particular, I was just trying to do everything and catch up with everything and pump out more and be more productive, and it caused massive burnout that left me just unable to come up with any half decent ideas for a while. And lately I've changed that, and I think I've got a more productive approach to productivity now, to put it that way. Anyway, who cares about all of that? The sling. Sometimes I just want to throw rocks at NPCs. Well, slings are underpowered, I would say that. I think they are represented fairly often in fantasy, but they tend to be kind of weak. I would say that. Okay, so the L1 move again. All right. I'll see what I can find. L1 move, Farron Greatsword. Well, we're gonna need a video, of course. Oh, there's a moveset. Hopefully I don't get a freaking copyright strike just for showing someone else's video. I wouldn't be surprised, because YouTube is anal about that. Thing is, this is 5 minutes of movesets, so I when are we gonna get to the L1? That's probably not really the right video. I don't know, man. This is pretty difficult to find just the one animation here. Yeah, it's all the entire moveset. Wait, there's a GIF. That maybe. No. I may have a better chance of finding a GIF. This one doesn't work for some reason. Why does it not work? Matrix dodge. Is that the one? Yeah, that's probably what you mean. This looks absolutely ridiculous. Like, just mental. Completely mental. Anyway, no salt, just voicing my opinion. You rock, man. Thank you. Maybe I misread it. I seem to detect a little bit of kind of a hint of passive aggressive in there, because it's like something cool instead of stream. Like, sounded a little sort of salty, but if you weren't, then it's all good. Whatever. I mean, either way, even if it was salty, it's not like, it doesn't really matter. It's not gonna offend me or anything. You can just say whatever you want, as long as it's not complete bullshit spam and trolling and all that. Like, your opinion is your opinion, and I'm always open for constructive criticism. The only thing I ask is that you please be specific when giving constructive criticism, because otherwise it's not really constructive in the sense that I can work with it. I need specifics. If there's something that you think could be improved about the videos or about what I do, then please specifics. Like, how about you do this or that instead? Whatever, just something that I can actually work with. I'm always open for that. Always. I'm willing to improve. And there's always something to improve. The Trojan horse is underappreciated. I suppose. Is the virus underappreciated, though? Check out the Falks. It stopped the Roman advancement. Oh, I know. I've shown the Falks several times. I have 2, in fact, at this point. So if you want to see the videos that I did with the Falks, if you just type in Falks and search on my channel page, you should find that. Yeah, that was the one. Yeah, I figured. That was just completely ridiculous. What about twin hooks? Such a wacky concept. It's pretty surprising. I've seen it represented, only seen it represented in For Honor. I mean, if in anything that's like a Chinese-inspired fantasy setting, they're pretty common, I would say. I mean, Cabal has them too in Mortal Kombat. So I'd say they're not terribly either uncommon or underpowered in fantasy necessarily. Of course, this is the comment that I happen to see. Say whatever you want as long as you're paying me. You could have just asked something that I could respond to, but instead it's just sarcasm. I mean, okay. I do read the chat, by the way. I've read quite a number of comments from the chat. It's just that there's so many in the chat, which, by the way, why do you think I posted this? Lots of people in the chat. Please be patient and respect others. Can't read everything. It's right there. People, come on. I'm not a god. I cannot read everything at once. Okay? I'm trying here. Fist weapons. I would disagree with that. Fist weapons are really common in fantasy, actually. Like you have something like the Kestis, or claw weapons, or armored gauntlets, like punching weapons, basically. I think that's pretty common overall. True longswords are underrated. They're seen as slow. Yeah, that's very true. Longswords are never really shown at their full potential, so to speak. Okay, what else? If you could use any fictional... Wait, oh wait, there's some more. Kugantob, Shotel, Mongosh, Assegai, Qatar, Makwahuitl, and every other non-metallic weapon in that video you made once. Yeah. And Shotel, again, I would say you see sometimes a Mongosh occasionally. And it's generally not shown in the way you would actually use it, though. Assegai, yeah. The Qatar, I think that's... Qatars are not terribly uncommon, and when they do exist, they can be fairly powerful, I'd say. Maybe the Assassin in Diablo 2 is not the greatest example, because the Qatars were kind of meh, but sometimes they can be pretty good. Hell yeah, I didn't know, Skull, sorry, I'll go watch. No problem, that's why I told you. So you know that it exists. If you could use any fictional / mythological weapon, what would it be? I tend to say... this thing. Because it's... You don't even have to use it yourself. It acts on its own, basically. I forgot if he has to actually directly kinetic like psychokinetically control it, or if it does acts on its own. But from what I remember, I think it's possessed or something, and so it actually can act on its own. So some kind of possessed sword that's friendly with you. That's important. That can actually, protect you by itself. Like if somebody tries to backstab you, the sword notices them, takes care of them. Stuff like that. That would be pretty cool. Like a sword familiar, basically. That would be pretty neat. I wish the staff sling got more love. Oh yeah, that's completely underrated and underrepresented. What about the Japanese Yari? Love your videos. Thank you. The Yari, I mean, in Japanese-inspired fantasy settings, it's pretty common and pretty powerful. Overall, not necessarily. Yeah. Kamas are actually kinda, I don't know, not super rare, and can be pretty powerful in their portrayal. I think the flail is depicted as too good compared to how it really was. I would say so, yeah. It is quite, I don't know, it's often portrayed as this massive armor crusher that just annihilates everything in its path, and the problems with it are not really, they don't really come through, like threatening the user as well. And I mean, okay, that's not necessarily the case if the chain is short enough, but quite often the flails that are shown in fantasy games have these really long chains that would just bash the user, like the hand and arm at the very least. The Spatha, yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. The Roman Spatha is, yeah, you don't really see that at all in this form. Pommel launching swords. It clearly has not gotten old for you yet. This meme is, what, 5 years old by now? Anyway. The standard spear is far better than portrayed in fantasy games. Yep. Absolutely. I have to wonder if Skull ever regrets making the pommel video. No, I don't. If I could have picked something else to be infamous for, I would have, but whatever. People are having fun with it, and it's all good. You can control memes anyway, so why fret about it? So no, I don't regret it. I really don't. In fact, haven't I set something up? Wait a moment. I think I did. No, not yet. Okay, never mind. I thought I had added a pommel GIF to my meme list here, but it doesn't look like I have. I should. Anyway. In all seriousness, what about the sacks? Yeah, that's not one you see a lot, and when you do, it's just kind of a low-grade dagger. So, yeah, you could consider that underrated, for sure. More fantasy weapons scrutinized videos, yeah, I suppose. Not my favorite kind of video, but a lot of people like it, so I should make more of that. Slingshot is only good in the Bible. Yeah. Rapiers can be underrated, yes, in fantasy. Auto crossbows are real but don't have much power. Yep, that's right. Any kind of repeating crossbow is super OP in fantasy quite often, and somehow powerful, but they would be weak as fluff. They'd be really weak. If you can just kind of cock the crossbow just with one arm, just like this, weak as fluff. Yeah, and the Falx. I would say the Falx is also quite underrated and underrepresented. Sickle blades, can be, but when they are shown, it's usually more like a variant of the agricultural sickle. Anyway, like I said, the original plan was to just stream for an hour, and I think we should leave it at that. We're at an hour and 17 minutes, so let that be enough. So thank you everybody for showing up. Thank you for the super chats. Thank you for asking questions elsewhere and making suggestions and all of that. Definitely appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed it. So I will see you next time, folks. Have a good one.